Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Thanks for checking in here at the We're Not Lost Private podcast. We appreciate all your support. But do you know how else you can support us? By signing up at Patreon. For $3 a month, you'll have access to all of our episodes, plus access to all kinds of bonus material, like our quarterly newsletter, photographs, and official paperwork, and research that goes into each and every show. You can follow the pod on a multitude of platforms such as YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, pretty much anywhere you catch your pods. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon. Welcome, everyone, to episode 46 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. And I am especially happy to welcome our next guest, Mr. Joe Balkoski. Joe is the former command historian of the Maryland National Guard. And frankly, if you're a student of the Normandy campaign and the campaign in Northwest Europe, you've undoubtedly read one of his books. And I'll just rattle them off quickly. But I mean, this should be a staple to anyone's library when it comes to this campaign. Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, Beyond the Beachhead, Tortured Souls, The Last Roll Call, and From Brittany to the Reich. Did I capture them all, Joe?
Missing one
Oh,
from Beachhead to Brittany, which covers the Brest campaign.
I failed you miserably. I'm sorry. um, just to set this up a bit before we start talking about this topic in depth. I had been ruminating over some comments that a discussion that Buck Compton and I had about the staying power of infantry. And he was very pointed in saying, we're a paratroop unit. Our job is to drop in, do our jobs, and then be quickly removed from combat so we could replenish ourselves and be plussed up in manpower to replace our losses. He goes, if you really wanted to talk to heroes about infantry fighting, you needed to talk to the men who manned the infantry units that stayed on the line the whole time. And while we could probably deep dive other more celebrated units like maybe the Big Red One, to me, and you and I talked about this in an email, I had restarted reading Glover John's Clay Pigeons to San Lo, who, by the way, the foreword of the newer version written by Joe. And to me, the 29th stood out like a beacon, a huge bright light in regard to getting into the mindset of combat soldiers. And before we went on air, we kind of laid out, kind of the path we were going to take on this. But just to get some broad thoughts from you, Joe, before we go into where we're going to hit our start point. Your thoughts about like just the overall concept of the mindset of a combat soldier.
Well, you brought up some very vital points there, Joe. The most important of which is the discussion you had with Buck Compton. That theme of talking to the men who were in the front lines more or less continuously was something that the 29th Infantry veterans, whom I knew by the literally thousands, it was a common point of I don't want to use too strong a word. It wasn't anger, it wasn't bitterness, but it was a common sense of frustration that the public didn't understand, that you were pretty much in the line. As they always said, there were three courses of action. One was to come out dead, one was to come out wounded, and one was to come out unscathed. And the last one was highly, highly unlikely.
Yeah. There's and this may be attributed to a veteran of the 29th, or it may have been the first. I can't remember, but the story goes that there each infantry division was sort of like three divisions.
Yeah.
You had a division on the line, you had a division in the hospital, and you had a division worth of troops in the cemetery. And I don't know if that was attributed to the 29th, but I think it would be pretty universal.
That quote, as far as I know, originated with the 29th Division, because the 29th it's sad to say, always came out of its campaigns with more casualties than neighboring divisions. And, there are very complex reasons why that was true, which we could get into if time permits. If not now, then maybe in another talk. But to go back to Buck Compton's comment, I remember many people at 29th Division reunions remarking to me about the 8th Air Force and saying, "Can you believe those people got to sleep in beds at night? Can you believe it?" And the incredulity with which these men, said that you don't understand that, we were living outside, and in particular, the 29th Division, by order of the commanding general, could not live inside a building or have a command post inside a building until December of 1944. And they were watching their buddies get blown to bits and more or less just waited for their time to come.
Yeah, interesting to go back to clay pigeons. Just reading John's talk about how his command post was set up, and all of his support elements, all his communicators and the other members of the S shops and the A&P platoons, all in foxholes the whole time. The
Yeah.
only luxury that the command post had, I remember there's one sequence where he actually yells at one of the guys in the A&P platoon who was digging his quote unquote the hole, the big hole where the main command post was. And by all accounts, that was luxury compared to what the other fellows were staying in.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, every story like this has a start point, and with the 29th, obviously they were a National Guard unit, and I think one of the things we can talk about with regard to mindset is the fact that they all, I had spent some time up in Bedford a couple of years ago and went to visit the area, and you notice the closeness of the community. And I think because it's a National Guard unit, and a lot of those men knew each other in peacetime, starting there at that point, and understanding the closeness of those men, uh, kind of sets the stage for their movement to England and D-Day, prior to D-Day, and how that will impact the division later on. But I mean, no, like you said, you talk to them by the thousands, and I think nobody, you're like the Jedi master when it comes to the 29th, and I think like understanding that, like, reading Ray Nance's book and understanding the closeness of those men, once you get into combat, that really affects you when you see your buddies going down that you've known for years. And I'm not just talking about training years. I'm talking about you've known some of the officers and senior NCOs knew these men when they were children. I
That's
mean,
true. Although that's a great subject to sort of begin our conversation, because yes, the 29th Infantry Division was a National Guard division, and it kind of defined its later experiences. But there are a lot of myths about that.
mhm.
Unlike today, and believe me, I watched many Maryland National Guard units get called up and for federalization. Every single man and woman today is a National Guardsman. But the only day in the history of the 29th Division in the World War II years was in which every man was a National Guardsman was day one. And that was February 3rd, 1941. It was 10 months before Pearl Harbor. And when, the G1, the S1s and the G1 of the division put their minds to paper, they said, "Oh my, we're supposed to have a square division of 23,000 men. And, we assemble at Fort Meade on day one, and we only have about 12,000. So by day 10 or day 20, the number of men in the division who are not National Guardsmen outnumbers those who are Guardsmen. And of course, that process continues all the way to England. And by the time of the D-Day landing, it varies from company to company, but the company you refer to, Company A of the 116th Infantry from Bedford, um, I pretty scientifically have determined that really 20% at most were National Guardsmen. And the reason they lost so many men from Bedford is that the company as a whole lost 100, 110 men within 18 hours, but of those 110 men, 19, unfortunately, were from Bedford. And no matter how you look at it, that's a huge hit for that town.
Yeah, the
But,
small town. Yeah.
by the time of the post St. Lo period in, say, July, August of 1944, you're not seeing many National Guardsmen in the fighting platoons. But what's interesting to me is that when you look at the rosters of the companies of the division as of D-Day, um, yes, it was populated by a majority of draftees, but look at the leadership positions in terms of NCOs, senior NCOs, field grade officers, and particularly the very important staff officers at division level. 90% of them are guardsmen. You know, your platoon sergeant in most rifle platoons, well, a majority of rifle platoons, was most likely going to be a very experienced Maryland or Virginia guardsman who had served in the 30s, you know, and these guys knew, um, about military protocol, tactics, even in the build up to mobilization, they knew that they were going to be called up, and annual training, which normally was 2 weeks in the summer, had been expanded to 3 weeks in 39 and 1940. So, these men were the cream of the crop. And if they had survived the weeding out process, which was very severe, particularly in 43 when a new commanding general came around, the division was a National Guard division, but it was guardsmen leading draftees. And I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I was aware that we'll call it watering down, the watering down of the National Guard component to it, proportionally began right at day one, but it really obviously accelerates the day they enter combat. But they are shipped to England in October of 1942. By November of 42, some U.S. Army units are in contact in North Africa, and yet the 29th uh, is back in England. And I think this benefits them for sure, right? The training regimen that they go through. By the time of June of 44, they're probably one of the most well-trained infantry divisions in the entire United States Army.
Absolutely. I mean, remember, by D-Day, they had been in a preparatory phase for 3.5 years, and that's a lot of training, and more or less the training in Great Britain was continuous, and in particular, starting in the summer of 1943, about a year before D-Day, they knew because Operation Overlord pretty much had been accepted as the Allies' major plan for 1944, the units that would participate started to become known. And it was obvious that the 29th Division would be one of them. And they hadn't yet decided on the transfer of troops from the Mediterranean back to England, like the 82nd and the 1st Division. But in essence, when you look at the training of the division in 43 and early 44, it's basically U.S. Marine training. They
Mhm.
become equal to not in terms of TO&Es, but in terms of mindset and tactical proficiency in amphibious warfare. They trained just like Marines for about a year.
Yeah,
And
you know, as a retired Marine and one who was steeped in Marine Corps history, that it's obviously part of our ethos and our training for amphibious warfare. But um, I'm sure many of my viewers and listeners know that the U.S. Army actually undertook more amphibious operations during World War II than the United States Marine Corps did, just because of sheer size and the multiple theaters across the globe. But yeah, I mean, the 29th was conducting training in amphibious landings from the get-go. But for the guys that were there, that like in October of 42, was the mindset, was it excitement? I mean, they're finally involved. They've deployed. I mean, this is what I want to talk about, is that kind of that shift in mindset, because I do remember reading several accounts where the tedium of the training later on it began to affect the men's morale a little bit. But for those early days, was there a level of excitement across the ranks?
Yes, I think that early on in Great Britain, like say from October 42 through the spring of 43, there was a bit of a morale problem. They were deployed to Britain and there really was nothing to do. They had derisive nicknames among the Air Force. They were known as England's Own because they basically were just intermingling with the English population in the various towns, first in Wiltshire and then ultimately Devon and Cornwall. And they had a different division command. They had their original division commander, who was Leonard Giroux. He's the guy, as you know, who ends up being the primary planner for the Omaha Beach invasion and commands Fifth Corps, ultimately throughout World War II. There was a morale problem with him because he was a bit of an old school general, didn't have much flair for the dramatic. Starting in July 1943, they got, as Giroux was bumped up to Fifth Corps to begin the planning for Overlord, they got a new division commander. And realistically, you have to understand that this person, Major General Charles Hunter Gerhardt Jr., to understand both the good and the bad of how these men started to prepare for D-Day and beyond. And, for the most part, although in retrospect, General Gerhardt had many, many flaws as a tactician and an operational general, he was brilliant in terms of training troops and motivating them. And a major characteristic of 29th Division soldiers was their pride. You might imagine, especially to a modern listener like us, you might wonder of the amazing fact that people could be preparing to go into a potentially violent and bloody battle storming the Atlantic Wall, that they were not only ready for it, but they were enthusiastic about it. And as you brought up a moment ago, I never heard of a 29th Division veteran saying, they didn't want to do it. They were all raring to go. And from their writings, you can see it's quite true. I'll just use a common phrase. I think I quote in one of my books. A member of a company in 175th Infantry from Baltimore said, there were 8 million men in the Army of the United States, and we were the ones that we were gonna make the invasion, and we were damn proud of it.
Hmm.
Sounds almost unbelievable today, given the more cynical
Don't.
view of military operations today. But yes, part of the reason they had been inculcated in this pride was the confidence and unit cohesion that was brought to them by General Gerhardt.
Yeah, and I think that's oftentimes understated. We talk about, guys will fight and gals will fight for the person on their left and their right, but in this case, this level of pride and unit extends much higher, up to, like you said, up to the division level. Um, and one of the things I do remember reading, because I've spent a little time reading through some of the accounts of the 29ers, and one of the things I noticed too was many of them expressed the desire to get it done quick so we could get back home. And I think that was a driver. And I don't think it was unique to the 29th. I think a lot of the veterans of Overlord had that in their mind. I want to get back home to my family and my life, and the fastest way to get it done is to do the job.
That's a great point because that philosophy came down right from the top. I mean, General Marshall, who basically ran the army brilliantly throughout World War II, I mean, thank God we had him. Uh, he was quoted at a speech uh, back in the States sometime in 44 as saying, in a democracy, you can't have a quote 7 years war, referring to the 18th century conflict in Europe that we call the French and Indian War. He said you can't have a 7 years war in a democracy because the people who are mobilized for war are really civilians first. And they need to have an idea that for success, it has to come quickly. And that's exactly what you just said. That idea filtered down to the command, to the general officers, to the field grade officers, to the enlisted men that, to get this thing over with, we have to hit the enemy with 100% violence and confidence. Now, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but that idea is very important in understanding the mentality of the 29th Division soldier and many other. I'm sure paratroopers felt that way too.
Yeah, I was reading the account of Leonard Lepessier
Yeah, I know it.
from M Company of the 115th, and he was
Right.
talking about the confidence. One of the things he talked about was the confidence levels of not only himself and his men, but his men in each other and their equipment, which I thought was really, really interesting. Generally, you sit there and go, "Well, I know we can do this because this guy right over here next to me, he's fantastic, and I as a sergeant, I would follow him anywhere." Like that kind of confidence is normally reflected, but I guess it's because they hadn't locked horns with the Germans yet. They some of the, let's say, inadequacies of some of the things that we fielded didn't reflect down on to them yet. Uh, and I don't know this. Maybe you can answer this because I was just in speaking with Buck's daughter. We were looking at some of his notes that he had left, and he said they had brought members of the 9th Infantry Division back to England to basically brief them on what it was like to fight the Germans. Did you see that in your research when it came to the 29th? Did they have a lot of exchange with combat veterans of the Army, U.S. Army?
Not many. There was some rather, what do they call it? Gallows humor. There was a lot of understanding from the Mediterranean theater and talking to people like from the First Division and the Ninth and the 82nd Airborne, that whatever was about to happen, it was going to be very costly. They understood that. I don't think they grasped fully the resiliency of the German fighting man. They didn't get that for some time. But this so-called gallows humor would surface a lot, but it didn't seem to dent their confidence. Like they'd be out drinking at an English pub and they point to the watch on their buddy's wrist and say, "Hey, that's a nice looking watch you got. That's the first thing I'm going to take off of you when you're dead." You know, that type of thing was, I
Not
guess
you.
it was one of the ways of coping with what was going to happen because they knew from there was talk that already before D-Day that the survival rate of a platoon level officer was going to be in a matter of days, and somehow they dealt with it. I understand that General Bradley went around Devon and Cornwall in early 40 or spring of 44, and he met with junior officers, company grade officers, and he said, these rumors from the Mediterranean, some are true and some aren't true, but the bottom line is if you want to survive, you have to be the best leader you can be. And you have to know it by the book, and that's your road home.
Yeah,
It didn't always work that way, but
yeah, well,
yeah.
I'm sure, they knew, well, one, I can tell you, and you know this, gallows humor to this day still exists in the ranks, and it always will. But I think it's more of a coping mechanism too. It's just, it's there for you to alleviate stress, and humor is the easiest way to do that in the ranks. I know that from my 20 plus years in the service. Um, But Bradley was smart enough to know that the conduct of the war was going to fall on the shoulders of the company grade officers. They were going to bear the burden of the fight. And I think it was very smart of him to go down and talk to them and reinforce the positive messaging, and then kind of tell them, okay, I'm not going to sugarcoat this either. I want you to know this is going to be a tough fight. We will incur losses, and it's going to be incumbent on you guys to be the experts at your craft.
Right,
Um, and
right.
so the other thing that was reflected a lot in some of in the things that I was reading from the 29th vets was, as they had embarked for Normandy, while many of them knew that this was the big show, some of them thought it was just like another training exercise in terms of, and they had done it so many times. It was almost like rote memory. They were just going through the motions. And the only thing that was different was the amount of smoke on the beach when they were making their approach.
That is actually true, as hard as it may be for us to believe that. I mean, some very intelligent, dedicated soldiers whom I knew told me that when they left Portland and Weymouth, the 116th Infantry, was temporarily attached to the 1st Division, and they left from Weymouth. They said, "God damn it, another dry run. Here we go again. I am so sick of this." But you would think that the bottom line is they must not have been paying that much attention in the marshaling areas, because I think, it was pretty emphasized what was about to happen. They may have been like common American soldiers, soldier trait. They may not have been paying much attention in the meetings or what have you, but it did happen that they only realized that it was not a dry run when they saw the chaos on the beach. Yeah,
Yeah, they see the flotillas there pounding the beach and the rocket
right.
ships and all that. Um, but I mean, I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on talking about Omaha per se, just to set the stage for after. I mean, because you've done many shows, and it's been widely written about. You've written about it extensively in your own Omaha Beach book, and I highly recommend folks go pick up a copy if you don't have it. It's an outstanding read. It's a smooth running narrative, and it's interspersed with the first person accounts, which really makes it, which hammers a lot of points home as you read through it. Um, but to me, here's the impact on mindset at that point, right? You have this closeness of these men who've trained for so many months in England, and the amount of casualties they suffer just coming ashore, especially those lead assault echelons. I mean, we're talking about, the National Guard composition. Here's where the attrition rate is accelerated at that point. Does the cohesiveness after several days, from June 6th on, does that cohesiveness that they had because they've been training so long, how badly does that suffer, and how does that affect the men they're brought in as replacements right afterwards?
Um, Realistically, the transition from the beach assault to the inland fighting was, in all respects, traumatic. I mean, but for many reasons, and it was partially the fault of the training regimen in Britain. I guess you can't really start to understand the mindset of the soldier post D-Day until you consider the undeniable fact that, unfortunately, most of the training in Britain was focused on the amphibious side of things. Of course, there was tactical training on common ground combat, but a huge emphasis on the amphibious exercises, and one might consider in retrospect, of course, that was the right thing to do, because had D-Day failed, then nothing else that came after ever would have mattered.
Yeah,
I mean, but there was a failure in terms of in many respects, of the transition from the amphibious assault to conventional combat. Uh,
yeah. There's that incident with Dutch Coda coming off the beach where he has to help an infantry unit, one of his infantry companies, or even I think it was a squad at that point, clear a building, and he
Yeah.
basically said, "Hey, figure it out, because I'm not going to be here to do this for you the next time." I mean, that to me, and again, the emphasis was, like you said, on amphibious assault, and as you know and I know, that the move inland, especially, and that you wrote so well about in Beyond the Beachhead, about the terrain, and hedgerows. I want to read this, because the quote to me is very telling. And those of us who've been to Normandy and have been down down paths lined with hedgerows know this intimately. But war, like fighting in a maze, and wherever a soldier stood, his view was blocked in all directions by walls of vegetation. And I don't think folks, even now when you go to Normandy, the hedgerows are not nearly as big as they're much more pruned and
Yeah.
manicured now than they were back then. And for those of you who are um, following this along on my Patreon page, I'm going to post up a bunch of photos of the 29th and their fight inland, so you'll be able to get a good understanding, at least visually, from this. But I mean, to me, that right there, learning to fight in the bocage was probably could have been one of the most depressing aspects of the 29th's push inland. Having to learn the hard way at the in the caught and the payment was in blood.
There's no doubt that for one reason or another, the preparation in the common infantryman's mind about the terrain that they were about to face was almost negligible, almost non-existent, I should say. You go back and you look at archival documents relating to the planning for Overlord, and there's no doubt that there are mentions of the Bocage country, but there's nothing in there that really emphasizes what has to be done in terms of tactical modifications. And there's no doubt in my mind that the training in England in almost no way prepared the soldiers for what they were about to see. It was a trauma, because of course it's a bit of a deeper question than that. The Bocage was the worst type of terrain that a unit fresh to conventional combat had to face, because obviously it was highly oriented to the defense. The Germans had been there for 4 years. They realized the implications of the low level squad and platoon tactics that could be practiced in that terrain. And in contrast, the 29ers had no preparation for that type of thing. So before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about, it's one thing to say a division can be motivated and confident and have very high morale, but it's another thing to examine their methods of tactical training and see how appropriate they were for combat against a highly proficient enemy. And there's no doubt about it. When you look at U.S. Army tactics, low-level tactics, like I said, platoon and company level tactics, in June 1944, there were very severe flaws. If you look at some of the field manuals at that organizational level, they're still talking about, on-rushing the enemy position with the bayonet and, grenades, and there's nothing wrong with the concept of fire and maneuver. Of course, that is a heart and soul of any good military low-level unit. But the problem was they didn't understand what the enemy was capable of, and B, the supporting weaponry available to the U.S. Army
Hmm.
that was not put to good use in any way for weeks and weeks after the Normandy campaign began, such as tanks, such as artillery. Now, I'll get to that in a minute, and such as air power. Air
Hmm.
power in particular was virtually useless at a tactical level for the entire Normandy campaign.
Yeah, but plus in its early stages, its nascent stages, the ability to call in tactical air support was still in development. So it wasn't like it was a refined process that was ready to go. And to emphasize your point, the infantry training manuals back then didn't have a way to assault what was essentially a small castle in every field.
Right.
And obviously the Germans in the defense have to the ability to dictate, several aspects of the fight in terms of when it starts and and the initial impacts of it. I mean, we always used to say, especially as a guy who worked in the S2s and the G2 sections, weather, enemy, terrain, and time always get a vote. And in this case, the Germans use that to the maximum in their defensive tactics.
Perfect point. To me, I'm a little incredulous to this day that given the knowledge we had of the German fighting methods in Africa, Sicily, and Italy, that the 29th and every other division for that matter was not really ready to comprehend the firepower that they and the skill that they were about to come up against. It was like a major league team against a minor league team.
Yeah, this is not, and by the way, this great discussion for everybody's listening. This is not to denigrate any aspect of the 29th Valiant Service. This is something that is endemic across the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps at the time. But they do learn, and those
Oh,
lessons benefit them well for the remainder of the war. But we're at that point now where the learning curve is very steep, and unfortunately, some of the guys who learn it early don't last that long and can't impart that message because it's a constant grind. And I want to talk about something you alluded to earlier on, and you may get to it at a later point. But Gerhardt and his idea of tactics and how to use his units, I'm sure influences the way they use this almost like a bludgeoning attempt to bludgeon their way through German defenses.
well, that's very valid. As I mentioned 10 or 15 minutes ago, the 29th Division always had more casualties than neighboring divisions. And that eventually, by early 1945 or late 44, was actually a major subject of discussion at the high level of command in the ETO. And people who've read my books know that General Gerhardt actually was relieved by his corps commander and approved by the Army commander, General Simpson, for the very reason that the bludgeoning tactics were very obvious and the loss rate was the consequence. And the only reason Gerhardt his job was saved was Eisenhower just would not let the relief happen. The Army commander had actually approved it. But I'll tell you a story. It only was about June, I think it was June 13th, only a week after D-Day. And, the push inland had begun, and the 29th Division was highly aggressive in pushing inland. The 1A, or the kind of chief staff officer in the German 352nd Division, even Zeigelman, remarked in his post-war notes, he said that these American units, are very aggressive in moving inland without thinking about their flanks. And he said, particularly the 29th Infantry Division. And that it says something about the confidence and aggressiveness of the battalion and company level officers. We're going to move. But we'll talk in a moment about the tactical problems that would bring those movements to a halt. But there was an attack against a little French village called Saint-Clair-sur-Elle. I believe it was on June 13th, and it was by the 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry. And the commanding officer was a wonderful, wonderful, compassionate leader named Sidney Bingham, West Point graduate, class of 1940. And, to think of him commanding 800 men, and he's only 4 years out of West Point. I know that was very common in the airborne, but not so common in the infantry divisions. Anyway, he said, he called Gerhardt in the war room, and he said, "Sir, the Germans are well dug in across that river and stream, more like." And he said, because of ammunition shortage, our artillery is unable to fire a preparatory barrage. And I advise that we postpone this attack until we can gather a day or two more of sufficient artillery ammunition. And Gerhardt said, "Absolutely not. You will make that attack." And his quote verbatim was, "Why do you need artillery? You have hundreds of brave rifles," alluding to the motto of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, "Brave Rifles."
Mhm.
And, Bingham, who I knew very well, never forgave Gerhardt for that. He said, he was very callous, and pushed his men regardless of loss. And but one may also argue that a man in the position of a 2-star general leading an infantry division in combat, he's paid to be callous. I'm not taking one side or the other, but Gerhardt definitely had more of that than the average infantry division commander. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a degree of separation you have to have from your tactical level units as a senior commander. I observed a lot of that being just at the regimental level at times, and misunderstanding by senior leadership of what like say an infantry platoon could do um, in certain situations, despite the fact of being highly educated senior officers and had
Yeah.
been in those positions much themselves in the early parts of their career. They sometimes forget the difficulties. And I remember just again in because I've been reading that in particular in Johns's book when the Germans they're scheduled for an attack, and I want to say was it Bellefontaine. They were supposed to take off on an attack, and
Okay.
he asked for preparatory artillery fire, and then there was a small engagement, and he wanted to fire some basically what would be called H&I, harassment and interdiction fire.
Yeah.
And the artillery told him, "Hey, we don't have enough rounds, so you got to have a legit target." And then finally, it was later that night or the next day, the Germans do a preemptive attack on their position, which included infiltrating their lines and cutting their communication wires, which I thought was very interesting. And the Germans talked about one of the Germans that they eventually interview after the war. It might have been the division commander they were facing. Much the same, like he said, you guys, your ComSec, your communication security is terrible.
Yeah.
And we always knew what you were going to do, essentially, because we had a bunch of guys who had, lived in the States for a while and knew GI slang and could work their way through a conversation on the radio. So they were able to, pinpoint and understand where the 29ers were going, in particularly Johns's battalion. And the thing was, he was a highly experienced infantry officer by that time, but even he got caught with his pants down.
Yeah.
But he learned, and he was better able to fight his battalion as they continued to go. And I thought that I like that he got to the point where he had the moral strength to go back and say, "Hey, this is a bad idea. I don't like doing this. Hey, you're putting my guys at risk for no reason. I'd much rather use artillery than waste my men's lives." And I think it all started with his radio operator getting shot as he moved up towards one of his companies, and he remarked about cleaning blood off the carbine he took off his radio operator, cleaning the radio operator's blood off his own uniform, which he couldn't get off. And I think those indelible memories affected him and allowed him to be a more conscientious leader. But I don't think that reflected up towards Gerhardt for good and bad reasons.
Those are great points. Glover Johns, in a matter of weeks, lost 3 battalion radio operators, KIA, and the 4th one, who I knew, obviously he lived, Leonard Bine from Oklahoma. He said he went up to Johns and said, "I'm your new radio operator." And he said, "Oh, okay." He said, "I want you to know that I just lost 3 guys in the last 2 weeks." So Bine was not confident in that, but he survived the rest of the war. I guess he was very careful. So.
Yeah. I mean, in that same attack, Johns lost almost he lost quite a huge chunk of his able company too. I mean, and again, I mean, he was very effective at talking about the mindset without specifically talking about the mindset. Losing some of his staff officers and the effect on the other staff officers because they become so close. How tough it was on his staff, and he immediately put them back to work.
He did.
Yeah, because he knew if they sat there and they were able to ruminate on it and further internalize and emotionalize the loss, they'd be losing he'd be losing capability. And that was, his ability to think into his men's psyche and be able to pull away the junk and get to I need this man to do his job, and here's how I'm going to make it happen. Um, Pretty insightful on his part in the midst of some pretty um, hellacious combat, infantry combat, close range infantry combat.
Johns was a remarkable person, a totally amazing career, and a wonderful writer. As you know, you showed the book he wrote. It is totally, realistically, that's what got me started in this whole thing when I was in my 20s, and I read a crummy little 25-cent paperback version of that book, and I was amazed by the realism of his writing. And he lasted in battalion command longer than anybody in the 29th Division, which it's a remarkable accomplishment because battalion commanders to Gerhardt were disposable. They were very changeable, and to have John's last from say June 11th is when he was put in, or June 12th through VE Day is incredible.
Yeah, you can see that about Gerhardt when you read his comments that as John's related them. But I know you and I had talked about him when you learned about him. I learned about him from David Hackworth.
Yeah.
And Hack said you should really check out Clay Pigeons of San Lo. This is the first time I ever wrote him. It was before I even joined the Marine Corps. And he's like, "You want to talk about infantry combat?" He goes, "Read this book." And my first copy got lost in one of my numerous moves. I had to pick up another one, and this one is dog-eared. Just absolutely love it because it's no hold barred. It's unflinching, and and like you said, he's a talented writer on top of it. But I mean, we're running on about 45 minutes, and I don't want to lose the plot here because we did want to talk a little bit more about the mindset during the attacks on San Lo, but I know you wanted to talk about Brittany and beyond as well. So you want to put the spurs to her a little bit and see where we can get at?
Yeah, sure. No, that's great. I was going to touch on the three elements that the 29th Division had to correct in order to become an adept fighting unit. And as you pointed out, they very much did become an adept fighting unit. And as early as September, almost all of these issues had been worked out, some of them to a point where by late 44 and early 45, the 29th Division, along with many other divisions that had been in combat for a lengthy period of time, was a top-notch unit that was able to execute operations that in 1943 no division would have been able to do. So the first issue I want to talk about is weaponry. When the division started to engage the Germans in the hedgerow country, a comparison of a German rifle platoon with an American rifle platoon is astonishing. An American rifle platoon had no machine guns. At company level, there were two machine guns that were under the control of the company commander that could go in different places depending on upon the whim of the company CO. Now, in contrast, a German infantry platoon had 4 MG42s and way more than that at company level. And the MG42, there are a lot of myths about it. Some are really myths, and some are true. But the issue was that the American soldier had been told that you would overcome enemy resistance by firepower, pinning the resistance, and then maneuver getting in close with grenades. And it just did not work because at squad level, the Americans had only one automatic weapon, the BAR. and the Germans were defending an opposite hedgerow with 9 men, 1 MG42, 2 MP40 submachine guns, and a couple of guys whose entire job was to feed boxes of ammo to the machine gunners. And much to the 29er surprise, the German resistance was almost impossible to pinpoint. Many reasons for that. The Germans practiced a tactic called Stellungswechsel, which meant change of position. Every hedgerow had 3 different fighting positions for the machine gun, which they would shift back and forth from, so the machine gun would not become an obvious target. And that worked very, very well initially for them. And the second thing was, the kind of deficiency in the American Army. I'm sure you've talked about this, Joe, but the deficiency in American gunpowder. In the 30s, we had supposedly invented a smokeless gunpowder, but it didn't really work. and in contrast, the Germans had invented a nearly perfect smokeless gunpowder, so you weren't seeing anything from their fighting positions. The American so-called smokeless powder was not smokeless. Have you heard that?
Yes, I knew of the German smokeless gunpowder. I'd read about some of the experimentations on the American side, and like you, I came to the conclusion after reading that we just couldn't perfect uh get a perfect solution on that. To your point though, I think a lot of people just don't understand, first of all, how machine guns are supposed to be employed. They think of machine guns, they think of some kind of movie where there's a guy behind a machine gun and he's just shooting individual guys point to point. And that's not really how a machine gun works, as you well know. They're meant to cover a wide swath of territory. And generally, you have 2 machine guns whose fire intersects and covers this large piece of territory. Now, the deficiency with the Americans' weapons, you can also point to the BAR, although a fantastic weapon, 20-round box magazine.
Right.
And then you have Thompsons, maybe an NCO is carrying a Thompson, 20, maybe 30 rounds in the magazine, but also 45 caliber lacking range of, say, the BAR or an M1 rifle. And then a lot of GIs who decided at some point they didn't want to carry M1 Garands, switched to carbines, and again, underpowered cartridge. Yes, you had more rounds in the magazine, but what good was it when you couldn't penetrate, say, foliage around a hedgerow? So, I mean, there's a mentality issue with like the weapons carried and the mixtures within the squads, as you stated, and it's running into this, the German method of fighting, which they're wholly unprepared for. And like you said, our training was to pin down whatever position we're going against, and then flank it and grenade it, or come in under the fire and grenade it. In a hedgerow, that is taken out of the mixture in terms of your ability to do that, because you'd have to cross into another hedgerow field to come around to the flank. And guess what? The Germans have a defense set up there, and then you're in this almost like rolling flanks, just continuing to roll flanks. And by the time you've gotten to 1 or 2 fields to the left or right, you're retreated down to a handful of guys from maybe a full rifle squad.
Right.
Just terrible lessons to learn. And the Germans were adept at defending that way, as you stated. I mean, just and they're having to learn this on the fly again because they hadn't practiced it very much prior to Overlord.
I'm sure your listeners are going to say, well, why aren't you talking about artillery and air power and tanks? And, because we dominated in all of those 3 areas. And, as you mentioned, Joe, if you've never been to the hedgerow country in Normandy, you can't possibly understand it. And there would have been no terrain less suitable for armor operations than the bocage in the St. Lo, in the 20-mile radius from St. Lo. It was impossible for Sherman tanks to bust through those hedgerows. They weren't simply hedges, as you know. They were earthen banks, sometimes 8 feet high and sometimes 4 to 5 feet wide. You couldn't bust a Sherman tank through those hedgerows, so you were limited to these narrow, I wouldn't even call them roads, they're really trails. And any tanker would have known that to be very aggressive in moving ahead of infantry on these very constricted Norman roads was suicide, because an invisible German with a Panzerschreck or a Panzerfaust could take you out and disappear in 3 seconds.
Yeah.
And again, I'll tell you a story from my book. I believe it was late June, maybe June 28th. The 3rd Armored Division had been brought ashore in Normandy, and the commander, I think it was Leroy Watson, who interestingly enough later becomes the assistant division commander of the 29th. He said, "Oh, put me into the line here, and I'll bust right through." The 3rd Armored was one of those heavy armored divisions. It had literally 6 tank battalions, so it's 300 Sherman tanks. It was a very, very formidable force. So the 29th Division was told on this particular day, a couple of tank battalions with supporting infantry are going to bust through the German lines 2 miles north of St. Lo. And, it was one of the worst defeats in the history of the 3rd Armored Division. As one of my friends in the division remarked, he said, "I saw people fleeing tanks and running for the rear like you couldn't believe." So the issue was, how are you going to make tanks work? And, we've all heard the story about the Sergeant Cullen, I believe was in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, who invented the so-called Rhino tanks to basically chop up hedgerows and make a gap so that you wouldn't be limited to roads. But it's a very little known fact that the 29th Division was way ahead of the game in that regard, and that their engineer battalion, the 121st, under the command of another super young West Pointer, like 24 years old, he said he went to his mechanics in the battalion. He said, "I want you to find metal rails from railroads. I want you to make them 6 to 8 feet long and sharpen them, and put them, 2 of them on the front of every Sherman, and weld them in place. And we're going to practice ramming these tanks into hedgerows and then putting explosive charges in the holes and blowing a gap for the tank." It worked like a charm. So well did it work that they didn't even need to put in the explosive charges. The tanks at 15 miles an hour would ram the hedgerow with the poles, and boom, the hedgerow disintegrated. And then from that moment on, tanks became a much, much more integral element in supporting the infantry who didn't have the firepower to normally overcome the German superiority. So that came way ahead of the Operation Cobra Rhino development.
Yeah, I read an account one time where they were trying all different kinds of techniques to try and bust through the hedgerows, not necessarily using vehicles, just trying to use explosives. And I might be misremembering this or misquoting it, but somewhere along the line, it basically they did a study on how much explosives would be required to blow a tank-sized hole in hedgerows. And I forgot how many hedgerows they said they could get through, but it would require pretty much all of the explosives in the ETO to go, just several miles, which was just mind-boggling to me. But I mean, again, if you haven't been to Normandy, haven't seen a hedgerow, I'll post up some pictures of them. But I mean, they had rocks in them in the roads, like you said, 8 to 9 feet tall, interwoven with the roots, not just bushes but trees growing out of them, uh, uh, as stout as you can possibly think. And again, and Bradley's headquarters knew of hedgerows. It didn't filter down to the lowest, infantry units. Like, hey, by the way, once you get off the beach, you're going to be dealing with this stuff after you move inland.
Right.
And again, they paid for it. But did you want to talk a little bit about Brittany and before we go? I know because it's about an hour now, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. I know you're busy.
Well, before I go, I do want to talk about Brittany, but before we get to Brittany, I have to talk about my artillery veteran friends who no longer living, but their spirits would haunt me unless I talked about how American artillery became the crux of the winning crux of American tactics. American field artillery techniques, going back to the training period in England, were just best in the world. The combination of the weaponry, the ammunition, and above all, communication was just superior. And of course, even though this wasn't written into field manuals ever, you can look at a wartime field manual and it doesn't say a thing about this. By common practice, every artillery battalion would put a liaison officer at infantry battalion headquarters, and that man never left the infantry battalion CO's side. And that practice in itself became one of the winners for every American infantry division in the ETO. And the problem, of course, was that getting sufficient ammunition ashore in Normandy, particularly with that terrible the Channel storm that happened in mid-June, really,
the Mulberry.
for about a month, crippled American artillery practices because we didn't have enough ammo. But the day that you mentioned earlier, July 11th, 1944, is really the first day in the Normandy campaign that the 29th Division proves that it's a top-of-the-line unit. It practiced what they called one tank, one squad, one field practice, which involved breaking through the hedgerow with those prongs that I told you about. It used pinpoint artillery fire on call at a moment's notice, even using Piper Cubs flying over the battlefield to spot the rounds. And that July 11th attack made a clean breakthrough. It was one of the most successful attacks in the history of the division. It was a 2-mile advance in a matter of hours, and ultimately, although it took a couple more days, led to the fall of St. Lo. So I don't want to leave your listeners without talking about how once artillery ammunition was provided in adequate numbers, the infantry artillery combination became almost unbeatable. It was almost like we changed our field manual practice of saying, we have to close with grenades and bayonets, and we changed it to we close and then hit them with artillery, and then they're going to be overcome. Yeah.
And then they finished them. Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is also not just with the artillery liaison officer at the battalion levels, but also forward observers positioned with the infantry companies. Now, a lot of the infantry units the seniors in those units could probably call their own artillery, but having that specialist there, not only to make the call for fire, but to observe it and then make adjustments was critical to not wasting ammunition. Because what does an artilleryman hate to do? Fire unobserved rounds, because
Right.
you never know what the results of your fire mission are. But in this case, like you said, the American combined arms is really starting to come into its own at that point in time. Whether it's at the tank infantry level or if it's just adding in the artillery, and then later on the increased proficiency in calling tactical air power, which obviously with Cobra, using heavies to do tactical air, not exactly doesn't really work out very well. And I don't mean to laugh flippantly about it, because we lost a lot of GIs in the first bombing runs in support of Cobra. But yeah, it took a better part of a month for them to build up the level of expertise where that successful attack on the 11th comes to fruition.
Right. Well, if I may I proceed on to the post-Normandy?
Please.
Okay. I mean, I think the thing you really have to understand, if you start to ponder what the American army was doing as the Normandy front as the Germans in Normandy were collapsing, is that every division that was involved in heavy fighting in Normandy was now infused with thousands and thousands of replacements. And that issue, of course, became very controversial. The initial practice of a battalion losing 50 men and then just keeping it in the line by grabbing 50 men randomly out of a replacement depot and literally putting them in the line. That never worked well and was very bad for morale because, as one of my friends said in a foxhole in Normandy, he said at dusk he saw a dozen replacements coming into the forward line, getting in the foxholes, and he said by dawn the next day he saw 3 of them coming out on stretchers dead. So they didn't even make it one day. Now, so the 29th Division became one of the cutting-edge U.S. Army divisions in the ETO into making that practice far more humane, if such a thing is possible in a violent wartime environment. General Gerhardt, with all the criticism one may make about his bludgeoning tactics, as we discussed, he established a relatively revolutionary method of acclimating replacements into the line. He said no replacement will ever go into the front lines unless they've had at least 3 days in a rear area with their battalion, not in a replacement depot, but with the squad, rifle squad and rifle platoon that they are assigned to. They will not enter the line unless they've had that time interval to get to know who their leader is, who their buddies are, who their foxhole buddy is going to be, and they are to fire. He mandated something like 12 clips of M1 ammunition on a firing range, and that made the process of acclimating replacements, although very difficult, it made the replacement's life a little bit more acceptable. And you find that in Brittany, the Brittany campaign was very unusual in that the Americans' 3 divisions, 29th, 2nd, and 8th Infantry Divisions, were fighting a surrounded enemy. So it was nothing but stagnant positional warfare and reducing the pocket by continuous application of force. And you can read my book and read and discern the very shocking revelation that the men had when they had been told that there are 10,000 Germans who are second rate, who are going to surrender, and finding out that there are 42,000 Germans in the pocket, among them the 2nd Parachute Division. And I mean, that was not great.
Yeah.
But yeah, 3,500 casualties later. But bottom line is, the artillery was working like it should. The infantry had now become adept, even though they were infused more with replacements than the original guys. And probably most important of all, General Gerhardt established the same concept of artillery liaison officers with the Army Air Force. He insisted that a P47 or a P38, the experienced pilot in ground attack operations, be assigned to division headquarters, and he would be responsible for air support. And it's more complicated than that, but suffice it to say that the liaison officer from the Air Force made the tactical air support work like a charm. And from that moment on, it did. So Brittany was a 3-week campaign that unfortunately cost the division another 3,500 men. So by the time the division moved to the German frontier in early October of 1944, we're talking that almost every rifle company is populated 90% by replacements.
Yeah, they would be lucky to have a handful of say D-Day veterans by that time due to attrition.
And of those D-Day veterans, no doubt that those had been wounded and came back. Almost unprecedented that somebody who was originally in the division on June 6th as a rifleman was not hit. I heard of one guy in my entire 35-year career with the 29th Division who was not hit. So
that's astounding to think about how many men passed through the division ranks during that time frame to get to that point near the end of the, get to VE Day. and how many were left. Again, the impact on the mindset of the men around them too. If this guy who's gone all this way gets, to use their term, knocked off.
Right.
Imagine what that is like to the guys that have been in the foxholes with him. And,
Right.
and generally by that time he's probably an NCO at the very least if he had been a rifleman on D-Day. Uh, just amazing to think about that. And then, just as we talked about, uh, I'm glad we just didn't stick with the mindset thematic with this. We got into the tactics and leadership and all the different aspects of combined arms. The show became much more than I thought it was going to be, and I'm glad it did. And I
I
hope
hope.
everybody who's listening got that impression as well. Um, I wanted to ask you, do you have anything new coming out? You're working on any new books? You gonna have any appearances coming soon, or are you just taking some well-earned rest?
I'm taking some well-earned rest. Many people are urging me to write, since I've taken the story of the 29th from the 30s to 1946, they're really urging me to write a World War I history of the 29th Division. It had quite a combat record in the Great War as well, but my entire writing career was based on the perfect storm combination of having access to the archival records and knowing the men. And I can't imagine writing a history of the Great War 29th Division without having understood the mindset of the guys. Very hard for me to grasp the different thinking of 1918, but maybe someday, who knows,
Yeah,
so we'll see.
I, I I understand that completely. I'm in the middle of working on a unit history right now, and to me, without having known the men that populated that unit, uh, I don't think this thing would have the kind of impact and value um, if I didn't know them, a lot of them personally. So I could definitely feel your pain with regard to that.
Right.
But anyway, Joe, thank you so much for this. It's been a fantastic chat, and I've really enjoyed it. Um, Thanks again for doing this. I know again you're busy, and it took some time for us to coordinate our schedules to make this happen. But the good thing is, it's still early on a Saturday. And there's plenty of time for both of us to get some things done.
Okay, I hope this has been informative. I could talk for days about the division, but I hope I've been able to touch on some valuable subjects.
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. And obviously, if you ever want to talk 29th and you have something specific you want to talk about, or you want to chat about them and you don't mind doing it for the listeners, and just please let me know because I would welcome having you back on the show anytime you want.
I'd love to. Yeah, so many more things to talk about. So yeah, just give me a call and we'll arrange a day.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe.
All right. Thank you, Joe. All right.